My name is Lena Park, and I am 32 years old. And I want to tell you about the phone call that reorganized everything I thought I understood about my family in approximately 4 minutes. But before I tell you about the phone call, I need to tell you about the payments, because the payments are the foundation of everything, and without understanding them, the phone call does not have its full weight. I started sending money home in the month I turned 26. Not because my parents asked me formally, not because there was a conversation with terms and expectations laid out, but because my mother mentioned during a Sunday phone call that the mortgage payment had gone up and that things were a little tight. And I said, "How much do you need?" And she said, "Oh, I do not want to ask you." And I said, "How much?" And she told me, and I transferred it that evening before I went to sleep. That was the beginning. What began as a one-time transfer became the following month a second transfer, and the month after that a third, and by the fourth month it had become a standing order that left my account on the 15th of every month with the quiet regularity of a utility bill. I set it up, and I did not think about it after that in the way that you do not think about direct debits once they are established. They become part of the architecture of your finances, present but unexamined, the monthly cost of being the child who does not let things fall apart. I was that child. I had always been that child. My brother, Kevin, was 35 and had been for as long as I could remember the child my parents worried about rather than the child they relied on, which sounds like a disadvantage and had always functioned as the opposite. Worrying about Kevin meant resources were directed toward Kevin. Relying on me meant resources were directed away from me, toward whatever needed handling. I had made my peace with that arrangement across 32 years of living inside it. I had made my peace with it right up until a Tuesday afternoon in October when a solicitor named Rachel N. went quiet on the phone in a way that immediately told me something significant was about to be said. Before I tell you what she said, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where you are. Now let me tell you about the search. I had called Rachel because I was thinking about buying a property. My company had offered me a relocation package, and I had been thinking for several months about what a move to a new city might mean financially, and whether it was the right moment to stop renting and start building something of my own. I had savings, not as much as I would have had if the standing order had not been leaving my account every month for 6 years, but enough, combined with the relocation package, to make a first purchase feasible if I was careful about location and size. Rachel was a property solicitor a colleague had recommended, and our first call was a general consultation about what the buying process looked like and what I should be preparing. At the end of the call, I mentioned, almost as an aside, that my parents owned a property and that I had been contributing to the mortgage and that I wanted to understand whether that contribution had any legal significance in terms of my financial position. Rachel said, "Let me run a search on the property and we can look at what is registered." I gave her the address. She said she would call me back. She called me back 40 minutes later, and she said, "Lena, I want to ask you something before I share what I found." I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you aware of any change in ownership of this property in the last 3 years?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The property at this address is currently not registered in your parents' names." I said, "Whose name is it in?" She said, "My brother's name." I said, "Say that again?" She said it again. I said, "Since when?" She said, "The transfer was registered 3 years ago." I said, "3 years ago?" She said, "Yes." I sat at my desk and I looked at my computer screen and I thought about 36 months of standing orders leaving my account on the 15th of every month and going into my parents' account, and from there, presumably, into a mortgage payment on a house that had been my brother's asset for 3 of those 6 years. I said, "Rachel, I need you to tell me everything the search shows." She told me. I listened to it, all of it. I took notes the way I take notes when information is arriving that I know I am going to need to be accurate about later. When she finished, I thanked her and I hung up, and I sat very still for approximately 5 minutes. Then I did not call my parents. I opened my banking app and I canceled the standing order. It was the first 15th I had missed in 6 years. It felt like putting down something very heavy I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it had weight. Nobody called me for 11 days. I want you to hold that detail because it is the most revealing detail in the whole story. 6 years of monthly payments canceled without explanation, and for 11 days, not one member of my family picked up the phone to ask if I was okay, or whether something had happened, or whether the payment was coming. They called on day 12, my mother. Her voice had the particular quality it gets when she's managing something, the organized warmth that isn't quite warmth, but performs warmth well enough to work on people who want to believe in it. She said, "Lena, we noticed the payment did not come this month." I said, "I know." She said, "Is everything all right?" I said, "I have a question I would like you to answer before we talk about the payment." She said, "Of course." I said, "When was the house transferred into Kevin's name?" The silence was 6 seconds. I counted. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean the land registry transfer that happened 3 years ago, the one that put Kevin's name on the title deed of the house I have been contributing to for 6 years. She said, "Lena, that's complicated." I said, "I would like you to uncomplicate it for me." She said, "Kevin was in a difficult position and the transfer helped him with his financial situation, and we didn't think it would affect you because you were contributing out of love and it was still the family home." I said, "Mom, I have been making mortgage payments on a house owned by my brother for 3 years." She said, "It's not like that." I said, "What is it like?" She did not have an answer that was sufficient. She said she would talk to my father and call me back. She called back 2 hours later with my father on the line. He said, "Lena, we should have told you." I said, "Yes." He said, "We were worried you would stop helping if you knew." I said, "Dad, do you hear what you just said?" He was quiet. I said, "You withheld information from me because you were worried I would make a different decision if I had it." He said, "We didn't think of it that way." I said, "I know." I said, "That's the problem." I called Rachel back the following day and asked her to walk me through my legal position. She confirmed what I had suspected, which was that my contributions, made voluntarily without a formal agreement, were unlikely to give me a legal claim to the property in Kevin's name. I had been making payments into my parents' account. What my parents did with those payments was their decision, and they had directed them toward a mortgage on a property they had transferred to my brother. There was no fraud in the technical sense because the transfer had been legal and properly registered. What there was a sustained and deliberate withholding of information from a person whose financial decisions would have been different had she had it. Rachel said, "The difficulty is that voluntary payments without documentation of intent are very hard to claim against." I said, "I know." I said, "That is not what I am thinking about." She said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "I am thinking about the 6 years. The total across 6 years at the monthly amount was just over £43,000. Not all of that had gone toward the mortgage during the 3 years of Kevin's ownership, but a significant portion had." I said, "I am not going to pursue a legal claim against my brother for the property." I said, "What I am going to do is present my family with a full accounting of what I contributed and when, and request a conversation about what restitution looks like, not legally, personally." Rachel said, "And if they refuse?" I said, "Then I have my answer about the relationship and I build my future accordingly." She said, "That is a very clear position." I said, "I have had 6 years of practice being clear about money with people who were not being clear with me." The conversation with my family happened on a Saturday. Kevin was present. He had known about the transfer from the beginning. He said, "I had assumed our parents had told me." I said, "They had not." He said, "I'm sorry, Lena." He said it with the quality of a man who means it and knows it is not enough and says it anyway. My parents offered to repay a portion of what I had contributed. It was not the full amount. It was enough to be meaningful and not enough to be complete. And I accepted it because complete was not available and meaningful was better than nothing. I stopped the standing order permanently. I used the savings I had, combined with what my parents returned, to make the deposit on a flat in the new city. It is mine, completely mine. My name on the deed, my money in the mortgage, my equity building month by month in a property that belongs to no one else and cannot be transferred without my knowledge because I am the only name on it. That is where I am. That is what 6 years built in the end. Not what I planned, better than what I almost accepted. That is my story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.